Hey YouTube, what is going on? It's Huncho here, back with another video. In today's video, I'm going to be focusing on the settings that are causing FPS drops for everyone in Fortnite. Of course, these changes won't solve all FPS drops, but they will help the majority of them. Let's jump into this video. So the majority of the time that people go and test FPS in Fortnite, they go into an empty creative lobby. And while that will show you your maximum FPS in Fortnite, it's not going to help you in the situations that your FPS is dropping in-game. So what I've done for all of this testing is go into Salty Towers and test from the exact same spot. I'm having a high rendering for the game, but keeping it consistent in between each test. So what I did was stand in this exact spot for every trial and look at the corner of the house for every single FPS testing. The first setting I want to talk about in this video is the Nvidia Reflex low latency on plus boost. So the majority of people now are on new drivers, not on 441.41. But if you are still on an older driver, I'm going to talk about why you need to be boost locking your GPU. Nvidia Reflex low latency is replacing the low latency mode that's inside the Nvidia driver and implementing it directly into Fortnite. The boost feature in Nvidia Reflex will lock your GPU at that boost clock speed even if your GPU has a low usage. This is what we want because Fortnite and many other games now are very CPU intensive, so even if you have a balanced system where your CPU and GPU have about the same clock speeds and work efficiently together, most of the time Fortnite is going to be running with your GPU at a lower usage percentage. As you can see in this picture, it talks about your input goes to the CPU, renders, and then goes to your GPU and your display. So the faster that your GPU clock speed is going, the faster that image is going to come out. If you're on an older driver, you should be using something like Nvidia Precision X1. And if you're afraid of overclocking your GPU, you can still boost lock your GPU at a lower clock speed. It doesn't need to be running at full force. Now, as I talk about this, I want to go straight into textures. The one thing that people always do is they go into creative, they crank up their textures to epic or high, and they say, wow, look at my FPS, it's 20-30 FPS higher. I'm going to use this as a setting. Please do not do that. It's not going to give you a higher FPS in the game when you actually want it. Sure, it might give you, 750 FPS instead of 730, and you get to show off to your friends, but it's not going to help you in game. These 5 graphs can be a little bit misleading, but for average 1% lows, 5% lows, and maximum FPS, you're seeing almost the exact same results within 1 to 2 FPS, so it's not changing your FPS in these situations. The graph I want to focus on here is the 95% maximum FPS. This is comparable to the 5% low FPS as they correlate with each other, just in opposite directions. You can see that when I'm in Salty Towers, I'm at about 411 FPS, but when I change it to Epic, I'm all the way down to about 401. That's a big difference even between all of the medium, high, and Epic. I tested this setting as well on 1600 by 900, and this shows that at a certain point, if you're rendering in less textures, you will get less FPS. When I'm at the lower 1600 by 900, I have varying results throughout these graphs. However, the one thing I want to focus on is our 1% lows and our 5% lows. You can see in the 5% and 1% lows that as I'm increasing the textures in Fortnite, it's significantly affecting my FPS. Even on the average FPS, you can see a difference of 3 compared to the average FPS at 1080p is essentially the same. So to sum up the texture settings, we want to make sure that we have our Fortnite textures on low in game. The next setting I want to focus on is multi-thread rendering on and off in Fortnite. The advantages and disadvantages of multi-thread rendering is that when it's on, you're going to see a more consistent FPS as well as a higher FPS. But when it's off, you're going to have lower frame times, more consistent frame times, and you're going to have better mouse movement. Now, while better mouse movement and lower and more consistent frame times seem like a better option, when you look at average FPS with it on, I'm getting about 362. Compared to off, I'm all the way down to about 292 here. It's a big difference in FPS. And while you might say, well, you're still over 240, you got to remember that I'm standing still in Salty Towers. I'm not building. There's not other people building. So the FPS is consistent, whereas you're going to have more FPS drops when more things are happening around your character. So you definitely want to keep multi-thread rendering on. This is another setting I want to talk about is view distance You can see the massive difference between all of these graphs going from near all the way to epic. It consistently decreases your FPS in all facets, whether it's high FPS and low FPS. So you want to make sure you have this setting on near and not on high or epic. Even on a medium setting, you can see there's a 15 FPS difference for the 95% highs and even 15 to 17 FPS difference for the average FPS. When you're looking at the 1% and 5% lows, this is where a lot of the frame dropping happens, because I'm going down to 305 FPS all the way from about 332. That's almost a 30 FPS difference, and having your view distance on higher settings is going to force the game to render objects that are farther away. The more objects that Fortnite has to render in, the longer it's going to take your CPU and GPU to keep up, and that's what's going to cause a lot of frame drops. I'm also going to go over this when performance mode gets fixed, when you're able to change between the bubble wrap and mobile builds or whatever else they're going to add for that in the next or future update. So stay tuned for a video on that as well. While everyone has been so quick to start using performance mode, one thing that a lot of people have forgotten about is the 3D resolution. This can actually help FPS lows a ton, and I'm going to talk about why that is. As you can see from these graphs, once I hit 70 and 80%, I'm having more consistent FPS throughout, whether it's the 95% max or the 5% lows. The range is smaller for these settings for our lows, but you see a difference of about 6 FPS going from 100% resolution to 70 or 80% in Fortnite. For 1600 by 900, I'm not sure what was going on with this trial here, but I didn't go back to test it because all the other settings were so consistent throughout. And while it showed slightly the same trend, it had less of an impact because the resolution was already so much lower. Lowering the 3D resolution didn't affect the game as much to either stabilize or give higher FPS in these situations. I wanted to quickly show the difference in game between a 3D resolution of 100 compared to 80 or 70. Don't mind my awful building, I just switched binds. So now as I go all the way down to 80%, you can see that the game actually almost looks sort of like how it does in performance mode, as the textures don't render in as clearly, but the quality of game isn't as bad. Now while at longer distances, you might notice more of an effect. The majority of Fortnite fights and endgames are in such close range that the difference between the 80% and the 100% might not be as noticeable. If it does bother you to have it on a lower setting, I'm going to show you another option and something that I tested that'll give you a better visual quality picture while still lowering the textures in game. So this has been shown a few times on other videos, but if you go into Nvidia Inspector and Fortnite, you can change the transparency sampling to AA replay mode all, and then the LOD bias DX. If you change it to a positive 0.375, you're not going to notice as many effects such as the shading quality in game or different shadows. If you go over this, you'll be able to see on your character and different spots in games where it'll look darker and not as clear. I tested this setting at 1080p, and you can tell that as I'm lowering this percentage here, it doesn't affect the FPS compared to when you're on 1080p 100% resolution. But just to compare the averages, it's about 374 compared to 361, 362 here, all the way up to about 365. So you're seeing almost a 10 FPS difference in Salty Towers from using the LOD bias on 0.375. This is a setting I highly recommend checking out until performance mode gets fixed, because at least for me, I do not like the look of the mobile builds. It's hard to see through and it affects my gameplay. As I already mentioned once, I'm going to be making a video again on performance mode once they come out with the fixes so it's more usable for everyone. But right now, try out these settings and see if it helps your FPS drops in Fortnite. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Peace out.